In the early months of 1942, when the Pacific War had exploded into a struggle across thousands of miles of open ocean, a new kind of American hunter prepared to slip beneath the waves. The men who boarded the Gato-class submarines did not yet understand what their boats would demand of them, nor what they would soon become to the war itself. They only knew that their world was shrinking into steel corridors, barely wide enough for two men to pass, and that once they submerged, they would leave the sun behind for days, sometimes weeks at a time. The departure always began the same way, under red lights on the deck at night, the crew moving quietly to their stations while the diesel engines thumped a deep mechanical rhythm into the hull. The water around Pearl Harbor glowed faintly under the moon, but beyond the harbor mouth was only darkness, endless and heavy. The submarine slid forward like a shadow, leaving behind the last safe lights of land. Men who moments before had been joking on the pier now stood silent, gripping rails, feeling the weight of something larger than fear. Responsibility. For the Gato-class boats were unlike anything America had sent to sea before. They were not coastal patrol craft, nor short-range raiders. They were fleet submarines, built to roam thousands of miles from home, to hunt in waters so deep and hostile that no rescue would ever come if something went wrong. The hull was double-layered, steel around steel, a design that let the boat dive deeper and endure pressure that would crush a lesser submarine. Their four giant diesel engines roared when surfaced, powering the boat through the waves and charging the banks of batteries that would become the submarine's heartbeat below the surface. Those batteries were massive rows of lead-acid cells, stretching the length of the lower decks, hot, sweating with chemical fumes, and heavy enough to anchor a battleship. But they gave the Gato-class a gift no American submarine had possessed before: the ability to stay submerged for more than 48 hours in silence, without surfacing for air or recharge, while their air purification system kept the crew alive in the darkness. This ability would become the foundation of everything that followed. The inside of the submarine was a world of its own, a cramped metal tunnel packed with machinery, torpedoes, bunks, pipes, wiring, and the men who had to learn to live among them. The air was heavy even before submerging, carrying the faint smell of fuel, lubricant, and stale coffee. The crew moved like dancers through the narrow passages, knowing instinctively when to step aside, twist sideways, or duck overhead valves. Every inch of space was used. Bunks were packed above torpedoes. Men slept beside the Mark 14 warheads, accepting that the thin sheet of canvas between themselves and the explosive was all the comfort wartime allowed. Still, in these tight quarters, men found ways to breathe, to laugh, to grip their own sanity. They played cards under dim red lights, tore open cans of peaches like they were treasure, or wrote letters they could not send until patrols ended. In the control room, the heart of the boat, officers monitored depth, angles, and course, while the helmsman touched the control yokes with the precision of a surgeon. The great brass wheels that controlled diving planes and rudder gleamed even in low light. And above them, the periscope well waited for the moments when the boat would rise near the surface, like a cautious beast sniffing for danger. Every patrol began with the same ritual, once the submarine cleared the coastline and the captain decided the sea ahead was safe. The diesel engines roared a final time, shaking the deck, before the chief of the boat ordered, "Prepare to dive." The order rolled through the compartments, every man snapping into action like pieces of a well-practiced machine. Hatches sealed, lights dimmed, air vents clanged shut. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by a deep electric hum as the boat shifted to battery power. Then came the command, "Dive, dive, dive." Klaxons blared. The submarine tilted forward as seawater flooded the ballast tanks. The horizon vanished, replaced by wavering green light as the boat slipped below the surface. The temperature shifted almost instantly. The air grew heavier. Moisture condensed on metal beams, dripping onto the deck like rain. Men breathed slower, their voices lowered. The entire submarine seemed to inhale and hold its breath until the depth gauge steadied at 100 feet. Then silence, real silence, settled in. The only sounds were the faint electric thrumming of motors, the whisper of water sliding across the hull, and the occasional creak of steel adjusting to pressure. It was in that silence that the true war of the Gato-class began. For these submarines did not fight on the surface the way navies had in past wars. They did not stand toe-to-toe with enemy ships firing cannons under open sky. Their battlefield was darkness. Their weapon was patience. Their shield was invisibility. And their sanctuary was the confidence that the enemy could not see what the ocean itself concealed. Once submerged, a Gato-class boat could remain hidden for longer than any submarine the United States had ever deployed. The batteries fed power to every system, while the air purification equipment scrubbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, extending life in the sealed vessel hour by hour. A lesser submarine might be forced to surface quickly, giving itself away to aircraft and patrol boats, but a Gato could lie still on the seabed or drift silently through deep water for 2 days or more. By 1942, that made the difference between life and death, because in waters patrolled constantly by Japanese planes, surfacing at the wrong moment was fatal. This opening patrol into the silent world set the tone for every mission that followed. The men learned quickly that the ocean did not forgive mistakes. The pressure at depth pressed on the hull like an unending fist. Any mechanical failure could become a death sentence. Any loud sound could bring enemy destroyers racing towards them with depth charges. They learned to listen, their ears attuned not to wind or waves, but to the heartbeat of the submarine, the faint shift and pitch of a motor, the distant thrum of propellers above, the change in airflow through a vent. These small things told them whether death was far away or close enough to taste. Yet even as fear coiled inside every man, the silence became their ally. The Gato-class boats vanished into enemy waters for weeks at a time, slipping past patrol lines, avoiding aircraft, waiting, always waiting until their moment came. And in that silent world, the legend of America's long-range submarines began to grow, not from battles won, but from the discipline to disappear, to endure, and to strike only when the deep allowed it. When a Gato-class submarine submerged for a long dive, the sensation was like the world tightening around every man aboard. The steel hull that had felt merely cramped on the surface now felt like a coffin drifting in black water. The temperature rose almost immediately. The air thickened, and every sound seemed to echo against metal plates until the entire boat felt alive with muffled vibrations. The crew called these hours the no-sun days, because once the hatches sealed, there was no telling when they would see light again. On this patrol, the boat had gone deep to avoid a Japanese reconnaissance plane that appeared suddenly on the horizon. The captain ordered silent running, and within minutes the submarine descended to more than 200 feet where sunlight no longer reached. The diesels were shut down and the electric motors took over, bathing the interior in a faint humming vibration. The red lights in the passageways dimmed even further, and men moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to create noise that could travel through the hull into the waiting ears of enemy sonar. In the forward compartment, torpedoes rested in their racks, cold metal giants with sleeping power. Men slept in canvas bunks suspended above them, arms dangling near warheads because space was so limited that there was no choice but to share living quarters with weapons. In the control room, the diving officer monitored the depth gauge closely, while droplets of condensation fell from overhead pipes splashing onto the metal floor. Every few minutes, a sailor wiped the moisture away so the floor would not become dangerously slick. In the battery spaces, heat built steadily. The lead-acid cells beneath the deck released a constant warmth, mixing with the body heat of 80 men sealed inside a tube. The air purification system hummed as it worked tirelessly to scrub carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, using canisters of soda lime while the boat recycled every precious breath of air. Inside these compartments, the smell was unmistakable. Diesel residue mixed with cooking oil, sweat, rubber insulation, and stale humidity. It was a smell that clung to every surface and every piece of clothing, and once a patrol ended, the men carried it with them onto the dock for hours until fresh air finally washed it away. In the aft section, close to the maneuvering room where electricians monitored voltage levels, the heat became almost suffocating. Men stripped to their undershirts, wiping their faces repeatedly with towels as they kept watch over the batteries that powered the entire submarine during these critical hours.
If a battery overheated or failed, it could mean catastrophic flooding or electrical fire. The pressure of responsibility hung over them as heavily as the water outside the hull. Meals during a long dive were a quiet affair. The galley was barely larger than a closet, yet the cook worked as if feeding a family at home, warming canned beef, heating powdered potatoes, and slicing whatever fresh bread remained early in the patrol. Men lined up carrying trays, whispering jokes but never raising their voices. Their laughter never rose above a murmur. The cook's voice rarely rose above a whisper, because even a dropped ladle might echo through the hull with disastrous consequences. Above them, on the surface, Japanese patrol planes circled, searching for oil slicks, periscope wakes, or anything unusual. The crew did not know exactly where the enemy was, but the tension in every man told the same story. Danger was near. In the control room, the sonar operator placed his earphones on and leaned forward, listening intently for distant propeller beats. His face tightened as he adjusted knobs, searching for faint signs of trouble. At first, there was nothing but the faint hiss of the ocean. Then a distant thrum rose through the static. Engines. Slow turning, steady. Japanese destroyer by the sound of it. The report traveled down the compartment in a whisper, yet the effect was electric. The entire boat seemed to freeze. Men held their breath without meaning to. The depth gauge needle flickered slightly as the currents shifted, but the submarine held steady at her ordered depth. The captain walked quietly along the control room, glancing at gauges, touching railings, feeling the vibration through the soles of his shoes. A destroyer meant depth charges, and depth charges meant hours of terror if the enemy found them. The boat drifted forward at less than 2 knots, barely moving to avoid creating noise. The helmsman adjusted the plane controls by small degrees, holding the submarine level. Engineers reduced the motor output to bare minimum. In the forward quarters, where some crew tried to rest, men lay in silence, eyes open, listening to every creak and shift of the boat, hoping the destroyer would turn away. Some prayed softly under their breath. Some stared at the ceiling, imagining the hundreds of feet of water above their heads. A long, deep dive was as much a battle of the mind as of the machine. As carbon dioxide levels slowly increased, men became lightheaded, their thoughts clouded. They breathed heavier, then forced themselves to breathe slower. It was a test of discipline, of patience, and of nerves. The diary of a young quartermaster captured the truth perfectly. We did not fight on the surface. We fought in silence, with patience and nerves. As the hours dragged on, the destroyer above grew distant. The sonar operator listened intently until the propeller beats faded and finally vanished. The crew allowed themselves a silent, collective breath of relief, but they did not surface yet. They stayed deep for many more hours to be certain. By then, the air was heavy with the weight of 70 men exhaling inside a sealed tube. Sweat rolled down their backs and dripped from elbows. Condensation gathered in droplets on pipes overhead, falling rhythmically onto steel like a slow-ticking clock. In the galley, the cook wiped his brow and opened a can of fruit cocktail that he had saved for the hardest moments. It tasted like paradise. The slightest change in routine was a treasure. Lunch might be cold beans or powdered eggs, but it tasted like a feast after 12 hours of silent running. In the control room, the captain finally spoke. Surface in 40 minutes. Maintain silence until then. The crew exchanged tired glances, knowing the wait was almost over. They had survived another descent into the deep, where time stretched and sound became a threat, and the only weapon they carried was endurance. When, at last, the boat rose toward the surface, the ballast tanks emptied with a soft rushing of air. The submarine angled upward, slowly, carefully, breaking the surface without a ripple, and the hatch opened, letting in a wave of fresh, cool Pacific air. The men climbed up one by one, inhaling deeply, blinking in the bright sunlight. And despite the exhaustion, despite the sweat-soaked shirts and burning lungs, they knew they had endured what few men on Earth would ever experience. 48 hours of darkness and silence where survival depended on absolute discipline and the fragile heartbeat of a machine hidden beneath the sea.
Night on the surface of the Western Pacific was a strange kind of darkness, deep but shimmering as moonlight broke across the rolling waves. In that dim silver glow, a Gato-class submarine could move like a phantom, silent, powerful, and nearly invisible. The men who served aboard these boats learned quickly that their greatest weapon was not just their torpedoes, it was patience. A predator's patience, sharpened by days of waiting and listening for the faintest hint of prey. On this patrol, the submarine had been tracking a Japanese convoy for almost 20 hours. The sonar operator had first heard it long before anyone saw it, a low, steady rumble of screws beating through water like a distant thunderstorm. The captain ordered the boat to follow the noise, and soon the bridge crew spotted faint shadows against the horizon, merchant ships escorted by at least one destroyer. They were moving in zigzag patterns, disciplined and wary, but not wary enough. The hunt had begun. The captain stood at the bridge under the stars, studying the convoy through binoculars. The cool night wind brushed across his face, carrying the smell of salt and engine exhaust. He calculated range and angle while the executive officer checked the position against charts illuminated only by a red lamp. No one raised their voice. No one spoke more than necessary. They all knew that a single mistake could turn hunter into hunted. When the time came, the captain gave the order, submerge and prepare for attack. The klaxons sounded once more, and the boat slipped beneath the waves. The deck washed over with seawater as the conning tower vanished, leaving only ripples behind. The world above faded into a muted gray, while inside the submarine lights dimmed and the men leaned into their roles like actors stepping onto a stage in total darkness. The approach was slow, measured. The helmsman made tiny adjustments to the rudder, while the diving officer kept the boat at periscope depth. The motors hummed softly beneath their feet, not loud, but alive, steady. The captain raised the periscope, lifting it with practiced precision. The narrow view outside showed a moonlit ocean, and far ahead, the faint silhouettes of ships. A merchant ship, broad-beamed and slow, another behind it, and closer than he liked, the triangular outline of a Japanese destroyer stalking alongside them. He lowered the periscope. Immediately, even that brief glimpse was a risk. Every sweep of the lens left a small wake on the surface. Trained Japanese lookouts could spot it if they were close enough. The crew waited in tense silence, watching the captain's face as he calculated angles and distances in his head. Finally, he whispered the one word they had been waiting for: fire control. The torpedo data computer, the heart of American submarine attack doctrine, came alive. Operators fed bearings, target speed, range, course, and the captain's angle on the bow into its mechanical brain. Gears spun, wheels clicked, numbers lined up behind glass windows. When the final solution locked in, the captain nodded quietly. Tubes 1 through 4, make ready. In the forward torpedo room, men tightened valves, checked pressure, and aligned the heavy Mark 14 torpedoes. These weapons had the power to tear a freighter in half, but the crew knew too well that sometimes they failed to explode or ran too deep. The Mark 14 was a temperamental beast, and every shot carried uncertainty. Still, they trusted their training, they trusted their aim, they trusted the deep to carry their strike true. Stand by. The captain raised the periscope, again checking the position, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, fire 1. There was a soft whoosh as compressed air expelled the torpedo from the tube. The boat lurched slightly, adjusting trim to compensate. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4 torpedoes ran silently through the night, leaving faint trails no human eye could see inside the water. The captain lowered the scope, and the crew leaned in quietly, waiting. Each man counted seconds in his head, the distance, the speed, the time needed for the warheads to reach the convoy. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The submarine turned away slightly, preparing for a crash dive if the escorts reacted. The sonar operator pressed his earphones tighter, listening. The ocean outside was quiet, then suddenly he stiffened. Contact, bearing 270. Something hit, something exploded. The first torpedo struck the lead freighter. A deep, distant thud rolled through the hull like thunder underwater, followed by a louder boom as the cargo ignited on impact. The crew exhaled, but stayed silent, waiting. A second explosion followed, stronger, brighter, channeled through water into the submarine's steel bones.
A third hit came moments later. The sonar operator whispered again, louder now. "Multiple hits, sir." The boat felt alive with controlled tension. The crew did not cheer yet. They knew what came next. The destroyer would already be turning toward them, racing in for revenge. The captain gave the order, "Dive deep, all ahead full." The boat angled down sharply as ballast tanks filled. The lights flickered, the hull creaked, metal groaned under pressure as they passed 200 feet. The destroyer above was already searching, dropped charges in patterns like a fisherman casting nets of death. The sonar operator heard the screws approaching fast and warned, "Brace." The first depth charge exploded far, but strong enough to rattle teeth. The second was closer, blasting a shockwave through the hull, sending tools tumbling off shelves. The men gripped pipes, rails, anything bolted down, while the boat rocked and shuddered in the deep. They had delivered their attack. Now they needed to survive it. In the darkness, the captain whispered, "Hold her steady." Every man listened to the rhythm of the depth charges. It came from above, then behind, then to port, then starboard. A Japanese destroyer was circling, dropping charges in guesswork patterns. The crew knew the drill. Stay silent, make no sudden moves, keep motors low, avoid creating cavitation noise. The submarine drifted like a dead thing, but alive with human tension. Hours passed, minutes stretched like rubber bands ready to snap. And then, as suddenly as it began, the pattern of explosions slowed. The destroyer's engines grew distant. Finally, the sonar operator whispered with relief, "They are pulling away, sir." The captain nodded, staying calm even as men exhaled around him. Sweat soaked their shirts, condensation dripped from pipes, the air was stale, but they were alive. Slowly, the submarine rose back toward safer depth. The attack had been a success. Despite the danger, despite Mark 14's reputation, and despite the destroyer's response, the Gato had struck hard and escaped. The men allowed themselves tired smiles. In the diary of one crewman that night, he wrote, "We do not chase victory, we stalk it in silence." For the Gato-class hunters, it was only one battle among many, a single strike in a war fought in shadows. But in that silent, watery arena, they had proven once again that patience, discipline, and steel could deliver devastating blows against an enemy who believed the ocean belonged only to them.
The moment the torpedoes struck their targets, the crew knew exactly what would come next. The deep growl of explosions carried through the water like distant thunder, and for a few seconds the submarine seemed to float in a strange calm. But every man aboard a Gato-class boat understood that calm after an attack was never safety. It was only the beginning. The captain ordered the submarine to dive deeper, and the boat angled down into darkness, water pressing against the hull with a rising, relentless force. The control room lights dimmed, the motors slowed to a low hum, and the air took on a heavy stillness that settled over the men like a blanket. As they passed 200 feet, the steel around them began to creak in slow, rhythmic groans, as if the ocean were whispering against the hull. The sonar operator sat rigid in his chair, headphones tight against his ears. His fingers rested lightly on the dials, searching for the unmistakable sound of screws from a Japanese destroyer. For a few minutes, all he heard was the soft static of the deep. Then his expression tightened. "Contact, bearing 030, closing fast." A warning, not shouted, but breathed into the control room. The captain nodded and spoke just loud enough for the nearest men to hear. "Rigged for silent running." Silence became their only defense. Men removed their shoes and worked in socks. Their footsteps became soft glides. Their voices fell to whispers. Tools were tied off with cloth straps so they could not fall. A single dropped wrench could kill every man aboard. If the enemy heard it, they would know exactly where to drop their depth charges. The first pattern came quickly. 4 charges, each set to different depths, to catch any submarine hiding below. The detonations erupted like giants pounding on the hull. Water hammered the steel skin of the boat, making every beam tremble. Dust drifted from the overhead pipes, and small objects rattled across shelves before hands reached out to steady them. The shockwaves rolled through the boat so hard that men in bunks gripped their rails and clenched their teeth. The second attack followed within seconds, closer this time. The explosion struck with brutal force, loud enough to make the lights flicker and the hull groan like an animal in pain. At 250 feet, the pressure outside was enough to crush a car, yet the submarine endured the added fury of high explosives detonating all around her. In the aft battery compartment, 2 electricians worked silently, keeping an eye on the heat building in the cells. If temperatures rose too high, the batteries could release gas or even ignite. In the forward torpedo room, crewmen held the heavy torpedoes in their racks with bare hands to keep them from shifting against their clamps. The nerves of the men were tested to their limit, but they had no choice. They had to remain absolutely silent. With every blast, the submarine rocked harder. One sailor in the control room pressed himself against a bulkhead, closing his eyes as each explosion rolled over them. He counted the seconds between blasts, trying to judge the destroyer's position by instinct alone. The cook in the galley wrapped plates in towels to keep them from rattling and braced himself against the counter. Sweat dripped down his face in the humid air as the depth charges boomed again and again. For hours the assault continued. Sometimes the detonations were near, sometimes far. Sometimes they came in clusters of 6 or 8, sometimes only 1 or 2 as the destroyer adjusted its search pattern. Every man aboard lived inside those seconds between blasts, muscles tight, breath shallow, hearts pounding. The captain stood with one hand braced on the chart table, feeling the vibrations through his fingertips. Every explosion told him something about the enemy above. Sometimes the blasts were too shallow, meaning the destroyer believed they were higher. Sometimes they were too deep, meaning the enemy was guessing. Wrong guesses were survival, correct guesses were death. The third pattern was the closest. A depth charge detonated so near the hull that the entire submarine lurched violently. Men were thrown from their positions, a gauge cracked, a light fixture shattered. Water sprayed from a loosened valve, and 2 sailors rushed to tighten it, using cloth wrapped around their hands. The hull groaned with a long, wavering moan that made every man freeze, praying it would not buckle. But the Gato-class had a strong double hull built to withstand pressure deeper than any American submarine before her. The steel held. Even after the shockwave tried to crush it inward, it held. In the maneuvering room, the electricians adjusted power to keep the motors as quietly as possible. Reducing noise reduced survival chances, but running the motors too low risked losing control of the boat. It was a tight line, a dangerous balance. They worked without speaking, trading tools by touch alone. In the forward battery room, the air grew heavy, thicker with each breath as carbon dioxide slowly accumulated despite the purifiers. Men forced themselves to breathe slowly, deliberately, fighting the instinct to inhale deeply as stress tightened their chests. The captain waited. He waited for the destroyer to make a mistake, to drift too far, to choose the wrong depth, to misjudge the last known bearing. The destroyer above continued its hunt, marking the sea with lethal circles. But eventually the pattern shifted. The explosions grew distant. The sonar operator leaned forward, listening. He held up his hand, signaling stillness. Then, after a long, silent minute, he whispered, "They are moving away, sir." The words traveled through the boat like a spark of light. The men stayed quiet, but their bodies relaxed, their shoulders lowered, their breathing deepened. They were alive, but the boat would remain deep for hours longer just to be certain. Every man returned to his post, operating in the heat and stale air, exhausted but focused. When the captain finally ordered a slow ascent, many hours had passed. The submarine rose carefully, maintaining silence until the hull felt the shifting pressure of shallower water. When they finally surfaced, the hatch opened and cool night air washed inside. Men climbed to the deck, their faces pale, their shirts soaked with sweat. Some leaned on railings, breathing deeply.
Others simply stared at the calm stars above, wondering how such peace could exist in the same world as the fury they had just endured. They had survived depth charge hell one more time. And as the boat moved quietly through the night, men below returned to their duties, knowing the war in the deep was far from over, but grateful for the chance to keep fighting another day.
Life aboard a Gato-class submarine during a long patrol was not measured in days, but in cycles of silence, tension, and exhaustion. The surface offered brief moments of relief, fresh air, cool wind, the sight of stars stretching endlessly across the Black Pacific. But once the submarine slipped beneath the waves again, the world shrank back into a steel tube filled with machinery, men, and the constant hum of war. Weeks passed like this without anyone seeing the sun, without any voice rising above a whisper, without any clue how the war was going, beyond the few fractured radio messages that reached them. Food supplies changed in noticeable stages. At the beginning of a patrol, fresh eggs, milk, and vegetables were stacked wherever space allowed, even in corners of the engine room where the heat spoiled them quickly. After the first week, canned food took over. Everything tasted faintly of metal. After the second week, the bread grew moldy, the potatoes sprouted eyes, and the cook's creativity became the only barrier between meals and misery. A submarine galley barely large enough for one man produced meals for 80, but the cook worked with a determination equal to any gunner or helmsman trying to keep morale alive one plate at a time. Water was rationed carefully. Men showered only when necessary, wiping themselves down with damp towels. Some shaved with a single cup of water. One sailor joked in his diary that he had never been so close to so many men and yet so far from a fresh breeze. The humor kept them sane. A long patrol pushed every man to his limits. Every hour a battle against boredom, fatigue, memory, and the gnawing fear of what might be waiting above them. A Gato-class submarine was a machine of war, but it was also a prison of sorts. A prison filled with brothers and warheads and the steady beating of engines that echoed like a heartbeat through the hull. In the cramped forward torpedo room, men played cards between bunks, torpedoes looming inches beside their heads. Others wrote letters on scraps of paper to wives and sweethearts, letters they would not send until weeks later when the patrol ended. If it ended. Radios brought brief messages from Pearl Harbor, sometimes a weather update, sometimes a terse encrypted order, sometimes nothing at all. And nothing at all was the worst, because silence meant the world outside was carrying on without them, that battles were being fought, victories won, losses suffered, and they would not know until they surfaced days or weeks later. At night, when the submarine surfaced to charge batteries, the crew took turns climbing onto the deck to breathe real air again. For a few minutes they stood under the stars, feeling the cool wind against their faces. The ocean stretched out on all sides, dark, silent, but alive with possibility. Every man knew that beneath that calm were ships carrying supplies, fuel, weapons, and soldiers for Japan, and every man aboard this Gato-class boat knew it was their job to stop them. The submarine became a shark, moving through enemy waters, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. They tracked shipping lanes, slipped past patrols, and waited for the perfect moment to strike, sometimes following a convoy for days through storm waves and fog before the chance finally came. When the attack order came, it came suddenly. The boat would dive, turn sharply, adjust course, the captain issuing commands in short, calm phrases. The control room shifted from weary quiet to electric tension as every man moved to his station. Men who had been half asleep moments before stood alert, eyes sharp, nerves tight. The torpedoes fired silently through water, then the submarine dived deep, bracing for explosive retaliation. By 1943, every man aboard knew the pattern well. Attack, dive, endure, surface, escape. Weeks dragged on like this: hunt, hide, strike, survive, and then repeated until fuel rations or torpedo stocks ran low, until the captain finally gave the order,
turned for Pearl Harbor. The journey home was different. Every man felt the weight lift little by little as the submarine left enemy waters. The tension in the air softened. The jokes returned. The cook saved the last can of fruit cocktail for the final night, a tradition aboard many submarines, a celebration for those who made it, and a silent toast to those who did not. When the boat finally approached Pearl Harbor, the crew lined up on deck, shirts faded, bodies thinner, faces marked by oil, sweat, and sleepless nights. But as the submarine passed into the harbor and the first sight of land came into view, the men straightened. A band sometimes played on the pier, and families waited on the dock. But even if no one waited, the simple sight of home was more than enough. Shore leave would come. Repairs would begin. The boat would be resupplied, refueled, restocked with new torpedoes and fresh food. But in that moment, as the crew stepped off the gangway, they felt the pride of men who had disappeared into enemy waters for weeks at a time, fought without being seen, survived what most would never understand, and returned victorious. The statistics would later prove what these men already knew. Submarines made up less than 2% of the American Navy, yet they sank more than half of all Japanese merchant tonnage. They were the silent blade of the Pacific War, cutting supply lines, strangling the empire island by island, mile by mile. But behind the numbers were the men who had endured the heat, the hunger, the fear, and the endless silence of the deep. They had fought in shadows, waiting patiently while the war raged above. They had fought in silence while the world shouted. They had fought in darkness so others could fight in daylight. As one crewman wrote in his journal upon returning from patrol, "We survived the deep. We survived ourselves." And the Gato-class submarines, the boats that stayed hidden in enemy waters for weeks at a time, would forever carry the legacy of those who served within their steel walls, men whose courage was measured not in noise and glory, but in the quiet endurance of the silent war beneath the sea.